right here, we got Brett Davis, we got Brian Wells, Kathryn Teng, Felix Frueh. They're going to hit you with a quick little lightning talk about who they are, what they're working on, and that one thing that's really burning a hole in their pocket. Starting now with Brett.
Great. Thanks so much, Zach. And I just sitting here looking at the title of our group, Personalized Healthcare Where Data is Being Applied, I wonder how many buzz terms we can get into one title. If we just put big data, the cloud, and accountable care in there somewhere, I'm sure we'd have all the buzz terms we've been talking about the last 2 days. But in all seriousness, I do want to start with a little bit of a definition, because personalized healthcare is one of those terms that means everything and nothing at the same time. And from my perspective as an informaticist, I really like to think about personalized healthcare as applying all data types to apply the right treatments at the right time to the right people. A lot of personalized healthcare focuses on the new sexy areas of data that we can generate now, and that's genomics and molecular medicine. But the reality is that we have a unique opportunity to leverage a broad plethora of data to find predictive markers, in some cases biomarkers, which we'll talk, I think, a lot about on the panel today, to intervene earlier and in a more targeted fashion. So that's the definition, at least when I'm talking, that I kind of frame up in terms of personalized healthcare. The other kind of definitional or concept I want to tee up before I talk about some of the work we're doing at Deloitte Health Informatics is this concept about personalized healthcare versus kind of value-based care. Yesterday and at times today, we talked a lot about this notion of value-based care and the fact that the healthcare system is unsustainable, and we need to find new methods of reimbursement to reimburse for value versus volume. And to a lot of folks that I talk to, personalized medicine almost seems incongruent with that concept of value-based care, because clearly personalized medicine is going to introduce new technologies, new expenses, and it's going to drive up the cost of the healthcare system. But I actually view those concepts as very hand-in-glove if we do it right. If we have a data-driven transformation of healthcare, personalized healthcare and value-based care are actually very congruent concepts, because if you think about it, and admittedly oversimplistically, both are about understanding what works for whom, why, and in what context. It's just in the context of value-based care, we add in at what cost. But from a data perspective and from an informatics perspective, a lot of the same fundamental underlying challenges are the same. And I think Brian will talk about some of the ways that Penn has approached the actual data challenges. But a lot of the non-IT and informatics challenges are also the same. The ethics issues around secondary use of healthcare data. Yes, genomics makes that even more complex, because by its nature, genomics data is identifiable. So there's a whole set of unique challenges around de-identification of genomics data, but issues of consent, secondary use, ethical use in different contexts with different stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem apply equally to longitudinal clinical and phenotypic data as well as genomic data. So those are kind of two broad concepts that I wanted to tee up. The one exciting thing that I wanted to talk about, though, that's kind of being driven both by health reform and the shift to value-based care, as well as the changing science and shift to personalized medicine, is that we're truly moving into an era where healthcare is becoming a team sport. And so there's a lot of exciting collaborations that are emerging between different stakeholders across the landscape, largely driven by data and the need to share data across silos. And one of those is some work that we're doing at Deloitte with Intermountain Healthcare. If you're familiar with Intermountain Healthcare, a large healthcare system in the West, 22 hospitals, over 200 clinics, a long heritage of using data to drive variation out of care, increasing quality while reducing costs at the same time. Some of you might be familiar with Dr. Brent James' work there. It's gotten a lot of national notoriety and acclaim in the context of the health reform debate. But we were fortunate to team with them to leverage and work with them to leverage the investments they've made over a 30-year period of time in their informatics infrastructure to leverage their longitudinal data to start helping to answer those hard questions in healthcare: what works for whom, why, in what context, and what cost. And what that's driven is new, novel platforms leveraging some of the technology buzz terms that weren't around 10 years ago, leveraging the cloud, leveraging a bunch of the new analytics platforms that are available for mining data. But to do that in the context to start working with pharmaceutical companies, medical device manufacturers, other innovators who increasingly, because of the pressures they face, need access in an ethical way to longitudinal data to answer those questions in the context of their R&D pipelines, their ability to work with payers to get reimbursement around their targeted treatments, et cetera. So that's a very exciting collaboration that I'd love to talk more about and how we're addressing it. And as we get into the conversation part, I'd love to hear from you, because I think one of the big challenges that we face is increasingly not a technology one as we look at personalized healthcare, but is a business model one. And I think finding these new novel ways for different stakeholders to collaborate is going to be one of the new frontiers of innovation, in addition to all the technology innovation that we're already seeing and a lot of folks in this room are involved in.
Thanks, Brett. Brian?
So good morning, Brian Wells. I work for Penn Medicine. It's the combination of the University of Pennsylvania Health System and the Perelman School of Medicine here in Philadelphia. And I'm very fortunate and lucky to work in a place that's invested in capturing electronic data about healthcare for years. I've got in a clinical data warehouse that my team has built now. We've got about 12 years data on 4.5 million patients going back quite a long time, hundreds of millions of orders and results in this data warehouse. And now we can use that warehouse to do some pretty amazing things with. And so while my focus in the past 5 years has been on building software and data warehouse on the clinical side, I've now shifted to doing the same thing on the School of Medicine side. And if you ever work in academia, you probably know that there's a lot of islands of data in academia. Generally, folks get a grant and they get permission to build a database. They get funding to go build a database, and they don't really think about it in an enterprise fashion. So I've got to go out and gather together all these islands of data in the School of Medicine, collaborate them, get them together, aggregate them up into one large integrated research data warehouse, and then connect that research data warehouse back to the clinical phenotype data in our health system warehouse to build this, in a sense, giant personalized medicine big data warehouse across our entire enterprise. So that's my big challenge. And we had a meeting yesterday talking about this effort to begin to gather up the genomic data. And I was talking to a whole team of researchers, and I said, well, can I take the 1,000 or 1,500 lung samples that you have and the 50,000 SNPs you have in your DNA test that you did on these 1,500 lung samples, and put them in the warehouse? And then folks started raising questions about, what about consent? Do you have consent from the patients to put that data in the warehouse and do things with it they weren't consented to in the first place? And I, of course, assumed that we did, and found out that we really don't. So one of the big things I'm kind of trying to figure out now at Penn is, what can we do with that data? And can we analyze it in a de-identified fashion? Does our consent allow us to do that? It could be that the consent is different in every study, and I got to go back into every study and figure out which patients were consented to do what. And as you might expect, that consent information is not stored in some nice electronic database. It's in a bunch of paper, in a file somewhere that has to be gone through and figured out. So we have to figure out at Penn to really do things with this data. What consent do we have? What can we do with it? How long does that consent last? And then how do we track that consent? And of course, patients can opt out of consent. And so you have to track the fact that this one sample didn't opt in to this consent. So you have to be able to track every piece of DNA, in a sense, and say whether you can or cannot use that individual record as part of a research and analytics or a study. So it's a whole new world of research for me and understanding for me about the challenges in the research space, how to get the data together, and then how to really use it. We think we can do wonderful things with it, but there's always, as you probably all know, and there's always that one last thing in healthcare, that workflow problem, that one thing no one thought of, that one provider that does it a little different way, that kind of stops some great concept from moving forward. So those are some of my near-term challenges, and I look forward to talking about more of it today.
Great. So I'm Kathryn Teng. I have kind of two hats that I wear at work. One is as an internal medicine physician, so I see patients 50% of the time. So this is adult patients doing preventive care, doing chronic disease management, and then making diagnoses for various ailments. And with the other hat on, I'm the director for Cleveland Clinic Center for Personalized Healthcare. And the Center for Personalized Healthcare was launched in 2011 to house this enterprise-wide initiative to try to integrate personalized approaches into the standard practice of medicine. And kind of going along Brett's lines, I want to just define personalized healthcare, because we define it a little bit more broadly. I think we do define it as biology plus preferences. So how do you combine all this personalized information about people? How to use it best at the point of care, get it to clinicians in an efficient manner so they can actually use this. And so a lot of my comments on this panel will be more as a generator of data and as a user of data. But really, in terms of the challenges that we're facing as we try to integrate personalized approaches, it's very much related to what's going on with value-based care and with accountable care. So when we first started out with personalized healthcare, the initial goal was to try to improve quality of care at a neutral cost. And now with accountable care, it's really all about decreasing cost. And so it's a question of how can we improve on the current healthcare delivery system. We know that we're spending more money than any other developed country on healthcare, and yet we score one of the lowest for outcomes and access, quality of care. So how can we really do better with this and also decrease our costs? So would love to talk with you more about that.
Thanks, Kathryn. Felix?
Felix Frueh. I'm an entrepreneur in residence at Third Rock Ventures up in Boston. Also a principal at a consulting firm for personalized medicine. I want to make 2 points about data and particularly focus on the application of data. The first point is sort of really large data, and the second point is smaller but very precise data and the way it's been used. The first example, prior to joining Third Rock Ventures, I was president of the Medco Research Institute. It was a research institute that was part of a large pharmacy benefit management company that since got acquired by another large PBM. But back at Medco, we had access to data from patients through our pharmacy of about 65 million belly buttons in the United States. And what we were able to do is use that longitudinal pharmacy data and correlate it with medical outcomes information. This is very messy data. It's claims data. It doesn't have very much specificity, but you can use it for to ask very fundamental questions. So, for example, what happens if patients get exposed to a certain drug together with another drug? How do outcomes look like? And you can use that type of information to create phenomenal hypotheses that you then can take forward and actually use to study in clinical trials or in other settings to look at what would really be the impact of changing something in that particular system where you now have access to that information in a way where you basically don't really have to do much because the data is being collected automatically. This is tremendously powerful and it's used very little. If you think about it, every time somebody goes to a pharmacy, to a hospital, sees a doctor, an enormous amount of data is being generated. But it's usually lost in the system. It's not accessible to anyone who can use that information to actually bring it together in a systematic form to learn something from clinical practice that we do every day, a million times a day. So the first point really is, can we use these large data sets, can we use pharmacy benefit data, clinical outcomes data, in a better way to find big associations that help us on a population level to make better healthcare decisions? The second point I want to make is, if you get much more granular, if you get much more precise, the power of this information is really tremendous. I want to use one example. That's a Third Rock Venture startup company, Foundation Medicine, where we're using next generation sequencing for the identification of genetic variations that would identify and help identify the appropriate medication for cancer patients. This is a true step away from the definition of cancer as an organ-specific disease to a molecular-defined disease. So if you have a drug that's approved for breast cancer, it works in breast cancer because the particular genetic or molecular makeup in that cancer is susceptible for the action of the drug, for the drug to work. That does not mean that the drug couldn't work somewhere else. But how do you find out about it? Well, you only find out about it if you actually go measure in fair precision about whether or not the drug has a chance to work. Now, as a concept, this may not necessarily be that revolutionary. We're already talking about the molecular definition of disease since several years. But what's really interesting is that once you start using that information many, many times, and you keep the outcome of what you're doing in a standardized format, you're going to be able to make sense out of unknown molecular phenomenons and use it for clinical decision making. And that's a completely new way of thinking about how you apply what in essence starts out as fairly big data, but is being distilled to a significantly more important granularity for an individual patient to really get personalized healthcare applied in the clinic. So I wanted to illustrate these two extremes because I was fortunate enough to see them in relatively short order, first working at a very large healthcare company and then being able to support another startup company in the actual application of this large data. So if we're getting much more aggressive with the collection of that data on a population basis and in a much more precise, concise manner for specific applications, we can do tremendous things with healthcare information, healthcare data.
All right, so here's my question, right? When I talk to people, just like regular folks, there does seem to be, at least in the abstract, kind of a lot of anxiety or discomfort even around this idea of personalized medicine and an all-knowing medical establishment. I'm curious to know if you guys, in your work, see that as an obstacle, hurdle toward realizing sort of these tremendously powerful outcomes that I'm all hearing you talk about here. That human factor, that cultural factor. And I don't know, Kathryn, I know you work in a clinical setting.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about how we're doing in overcoming some of that ick factor that can come with personalized medicine?
Well, I think it's certainly a challenge. I think there's certainly a lot of hesitancy out there, and I think especially from the standpoint of a hospital system that is providing data potentially to many others who want the data, we really have to be very careful because our patients are coming to us because they trust us, right? They trust us to keep their information private. And so this has been a huge challenge. I think that with time, our approach has been education, to all of our providers, but also to our patients, and to try to change the culture a little bit, because I think that things are changing. I think with, Facebook and all of the ways that we communicate with social media nowadays, people are getting used to the concept of not being as private. I think people are welcoming it more, especially the younger generation. But at the same time, we do need to educate our patients and our communities about the value to them and what they have to gain by giving up some of that privacy. Because the truth is, genomic information is never going to be totally de-identifiable. It's always to some extent identifiable. And so it's really creating culture change in getting people to participate in their health care. And that means not only participating with their health journeys and their health goals with their clinicians, but also participating in research and in discovery. So I think this is the wave of the future, is trying to get people changing that culture so that we get more participation.
I mean, Brian, you mentioned sort of digging around these paper documents looking for consent. Across the board. I mean, you're running into a lot of these challenges. Do you have any thoughts on sort of, again, that big picture, that kind of unease about some of these privacy issues?
I think our patients, whether they're research subjects or patients, trust us if they think the data stays within our walls and stays secure inside our firewall, and that we're on the hook for breach of that data. And I think they trust us to guard their data. I think their fear is that we're going to contribute that data to some giant pool. And then once you start to put consumer data along with healthcare data, along with payer data, along with any other type of unrelated data that can become all of a sudden related, right? Now the risk of re-identification grows significantly. And so we're very concerned about what happened, not so much what we do with our data. We're very concerned. We guard that, we protect that. But if we were to share some of that, even in a de-identified fashion with an external party, what are they then going to take and combine with that? Mm-hmm. And we try to control what they do with it through contractual terms and all that. But we don't, and once they have a copy, you don't really know what they're doing with it. And so that, I think, is the fear. Everyone sees the value of combining data, but the risk of re-identification goes up significantly when you do that.
Yeah, and just to add to this and maybe even be a little bit contrarian, one of my favorite quotes is, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." And I think on this whole consent issue and reuse of data, there's actually some initiatives out there that we can look at that may point to a little bit of a path in the future. And I think this may also speak to what disease we're talking about when we talk about personalized healthcare. Because in a disease like cancer, somebody using your data doesn't bother you quite as much. But to the average Joe seeing the primary care physician, personalized healthcare isn't just personal, I'm seeing you. It's probably a foreign concept. But the initiative I want to highlight, I've done a lot of work with Moffitt Cancer Center in the past, and some of you might be familiar or have heard of their Total Cancer Care initiative that was started about 6-7 years ago now, where they actually started proactively and prospectively asking patients for 3 simple things in a prospective consent. Can we use all of your data for research purposes, broadly defined, including working with the pharmaceutical industry and biotech industry? 2, can we recontact you and longitudinally follow you over time? And they set up patient portals and things like that for collecting data beyond what was captured in the EMR to actually do that. And then 3, can we use any of your leftover serum, blood, tissue, et cetera, that we collect through the normal course of care, bank it in a biobank, and then use it for molecular profiling to understand the underlying molecular causes of your disease? That simple consent was actually pretty innovative and revolutionary at the time, 6-7 years ago, and their consent rates were as high as 95-96% in terms of folks consenting, and they actually expanded beyond Moffitt and have 17 community cancer centers around the country that are also contributing to the protocol. So I like to look at that. Now, granted, it is cancer, so it's a slightly different psychology in terms of sharing your data. But even if in a broader population, if a similar standard consent was done more broadly, I would like to think that with the right education and right explanation that this data would be used so that we can truly create the learning healthcare system where every encounter is something we can learn from, that even if only 50% of the population, from 95% would consent to something broadly like that, we'd start to unlock the data that Brian talked about that currently sits in silos because of all these patchwork of IRBs and consents and complexity, and really start to unlock the value of the data as long as we have the right protections. So that gets back to my opening point that personalized medicine is much more than a technology challenge. It's a political one, it's a communications one, it's a consent, et cetera. So that's kind of some of my observations.
I can just underline that. In our experience, when at Medco we had several clinical programs for pharmacogenetics, and what was really interesting was the way these programs were set up was when somebody comes to the pharmacy with a prescription for a drug for which there would be a genetic test available that helps guide therapy, we were able to contact the patient and or physician basically in real time because that's when we got the information about the patient being at the pharmacy, inform them about the availability of the genetic test and see whether they're willing to do that, whether they think that might be a good idea. What was interesting is that when we were contacting patients, the acceptance of doing a genetic test was about 85% saying yes. When we contacted the physician first, it was way lower. And that might have different reasons. However, the bigger message is that I absolutely do not believe that there is a fear, a significantly big fear in the population about what we're talking about. I think this is much more portrayed by the professionals and by ethicists. So I have absolute confidence in the population, in patients being willing to not only participate in research, because a lot of what we were doing was research-based, but also in the actual use for this information in clinical decision-making. What is absolutely key is the upfront education, what you're going to be doing with this information and how it can be used and whether or not it can be used in the future as well. But by and large, I have absolutely no issues believing that generally we're going to be able to access that information.
So you're saying
we're putting artificial boundaries in place that we absolutely don't need.
Can I just comment on that? I mean, I think that you hit on a very important point, which is the trust. Mm-hmm. We are actually also in the process of setting up this similar consent form, starting to bank people's specimens, discarded blood samples, et cetera, banking their data. And I think we've seen that there's been a progression across the country in terms of consent. So I think initially, when Vanderbilt started out, it was opt-out, and now I think even our bioethicists are saying to us, this has to be opt-in, but it's really considered, it's been done. People are doing this now. It's pretty well accepted. You have an opt-in consent. But it is about that trust that you do need to go out there and you need to say to your community and your patient communities in particular, here's what we're doing. Be transparent about it and get their feedback and get their involvement in it so that they don't feel like you're hiding something. So the trust is critical to the consent.
Well, Felix, I guess, and also Brian, I'm curious to know what boundaries you think should exist, if any. What guidelines do you think should dictate sort of this personalized medicine space going forward?
So, I mean, there's federal regulations, obviously, with HIPAA and high tech that, we're quite paranoid about, and, rightfully so. It's gotten, the rules have just changed again, where it used to be that if you thought maybe there really wasn't a breach, you didn't have to let anybody know. Well, now, whether you're confident or not that you had a breach, if you have any inkling at all, whether it really was, you have to notify. And so that, because of that, we're just very intent and very concerned about what happens to the data once it leaves our shop. Within our world, we're very comfortable that we can manage the data and track it and secure it and keep it safe. But when it starts to really, we just don't give it out to folks, even in a de-identified fashion at all.
Well, before we move on, Felix, I'm curious as to your...
Yeah, I mean, I think Brett had hit on something really important, and basically, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's an analogy that I've been using since years. There is a seminal moment in somebody's life when the acceptance of higher risk becomes a non-issue, and that is at the point when you become a patient. It's absolutely fascinating how opinions change about what is right or wrong at the point when you actually really need something. And it's no surprise to me that organizations and now companies such as Patients Like Me are successful because they are addressing the immediate needs of someone who actually needs care and wants to learn as much as they possibly can about what is the best way to help each other make better healthcare decisions. So it's absolutely incomprehensible to me why we're not just going a step further and say, well, you know what, I'm not a patient yet, but probably I have some inherent characteristics that are going to be helpful for others to make better healthcare decisions as well. So I'm not saying that we just should blow everything open, but I am, also aware that we have HIPAA, we have all sorts of regulations in place that basically we have the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. I mean, it's basically written in the law that we're not supposed to, abuse that information. So I think we should think a little bit more liberal about how we use that information.
Yeah, so I agree with Felix's points, putting kind of a pragmatic lens on the situation today and addressing some of Brian's points. I think this is where innovation can apply both from a technology perspective and from a business model perspective. So, for example, with Intermountain, everybody focuses on the data, but what people really want are the insights from the data. And with Intermountain, we think we've innovated where their data never leaves their firewall, their four walls. In fact, we've got a double-blinded de-identification process like the old Cold War days with the 2 keys for nuclear weapons that Deloitte and Intermountain to re-identify need to come together. And that's absolutely at the center of what we're doing. But the innovation from a business model perspective is we're not selling data. We're actually providing insights into their data across their populations for the end consumer. So there's zero chance of any data ever being misused or used outside of the intent of the actual insights that are being applied in our analytics platform. So I use that as just an example of there are now technologies and innovative business model ways to live up to the high standards of high tech and HIPAA, but also glean insights from the data without shipping it around or selling it or losing control over it as an institution or as an individual.
So you're saying that it may be a false dichotomy of the sort of privacy versus business ecosystem around health data that's being generated by large providers? You're saying that dichotomy doesn't have to exist?
I think there's going to always be this tension between openness and innovation and security. I mean, we see this in every industry, but it's particularly acute in healthcare. I think, my personal preference, not speaking for Deloitte, I tend to come down more on the innovation side of the argument, but the reality is we're going to have regulation and privacy for good reasons, and we should find ethical ways to innovate and take advantage of what we can learn from the data, much to Brian's point.
I think the dichotomy is you can't do personalized medicine unless you have access to lots of populations of data. You can't discover that individual highly predictive genetic marker for a human without looking at thousands of humans to figure out if it really is predictive. And so, you have to bring it together to make the discoveries. So there's a difference between a single person's privacy and the privacy of tens of thousands in aggregate.
I think that's absolutely that's the key point, because we all want what works best for ourselves as an individual, but we're somehow paranoid about that information being used in a broader context, and I think that's where we have to get more sensible about it.
Yeah. Mixing it up a little bit. Recently, Angelina Jolie, in a way, became sort of an unexpected poster girl for the field of personalized medicine. And my question to you is so if I'm the reporter calling you on deadline for the bigger picture, what takeaway to my audience of healthcare consumers do you want them to take? What's the lesson of the Angelina Jolie story as it relates to personalized medicine? Kathryn?
Well, I'll say what I said backstage, which is, where are her ovaries? was my first comment, because we know that these genetic mutations put people at risk for ovarian cancer, which is very difficult to detect and very deadly for many people with this condition. But I think that in general, I think Angelina Jolie I look at it as a positive for personalized medicine, because I think it has brought awareness to the role that genetics plays in terms of risk, and that you can be proactive when I say patient, I should clarify, patients, I refer to everybody as a patient, because I feel that we're all patients, whether we're in our well state or our ill state. So I think that she's a good example of a patient who has really taken her health into her hands. She has some control over her destiny, and I think she's really been a good influence, I think, on personalized medicine.
Have you seen those kind of conversations filtering into the clinic setting?
Definitely. So I've actually had a number of people, call me up and say, "Oh, I had this relative, that relative with breast cancer. Do I need to get this genetic testing?" And so I think it has brought to light the need to educate our clinicians who may not be as well informed in genetic risk, so they can help identify people who really are at risk and who need genetic testing, because a lot of risk can just be really determined based on family history and does not require expensive testing. And I think it also brings up the need for geneticists, medical geneticists and genetic counselors who can really help us to screen these people, triage them, and make sure that they get the appropriate testing or screening that they need. So that's been very important.
Before we move on, the genetic counselor idea, can you unpack that a little bit? How is the Cleveland Clinic using genetic counselors and to what end?
Sure. So genetic counselors are licensed masters in science degree professionals who basically, they're the ones who take in-depth family histories on people who may be at risk. We refer, as a clinician, I would refer somebody who I thought had an increased risk for any disease. It could be cancer, it could be clotting disorders, it could be sickle cell disease, it could be anything. So and they will spend that time with the patients. They will counsel them. They'll get family histories. They'll order the tests that are needed. They will get insurance coverage they'll go to bat for them to get these tests covered if they need them. And they'll also spend a lot of that one-on-one time reassuring or providing guidance in terms of what this means from a ethical, legal, societal standpoint, discrimination concerns that people might have. So it's a very important profession that we have access to. And I think many hospitals, I don't know how many hospital systems around the country have a strong core of genetic counselors. I know there's a shortage nationwide of medical geneticists and genetic counselors, but this is a very important resource, I think, as we move forward, because we are going to be learning more and more about the risk based on genetics.
Shifting to the business side of the personalized medicine debate or conversation, where do you guys see? I guess more Felix and Brett. Where are companies seeing opportunity, basically, as it relates to personalized medicine? What are we talking about when we're talking about companies that are getting into the space, seeing opportunity to make money?
Why don't you take it?
So I want to split it up into, we talk about data, but I'm going to split it up into basically two categories, sort of the drug development part and the diagnostic part. If we're looking at personalized medicine, I mean, it came out of the ability to measure. So the diagnostic piece is an inherent necessity to, I think, let's call it the modern definition of personalized medicine. I guess you would call pretty much any doctor-patient interaction personal at some level. But using modern technology to measure, let's say, molecular markers for making better healthcare decisions really comes out of the ability for us today to precisely measure something. Unfortunately, that has come sort of on the heels of other technologies that really have become a commodity in healthcare. And therefore, I think the innovation that happened over the last decade or 2 decades in really the space that enabled personalized medicine to begin with hasn't been rewarded quite as well. So on the diagnostic side, from a business perspective, I see difficult times, and that's not because technology is problematic, but it's because the reimbursement system that we have in this country does not really reward that innovation. On the drug development side, however, I see tremendous potential. I think there is, given that we were talking about sort of a drought in novel molecules and innovation in the pharmaceutical industry, I think this really enables us to get to new heights in drug development. And the question is, how can you align those two phenomenons in such a way that the enabling technology gets rewarded in such a way in the future that there is still enough enthusiasm and innovation to drive that forward and really help developing better and more precise medicines.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I agree completely with everything Felix just articulated. And this is where, getting back to my opening comments, where not only from a concept perspective, but from an actual driver perspective in the market, the concepts of value-based care and personalized medicine actually could end up becoming best friends, because the ironic part is the diagnostic test that enables earlier identification of disease onset, that helps precisely more target a therapy or a treatment, hasn't been rewarded in our current system. Like a lot of things in the healthcare system, the thing that gets rewarded is treatment downstream. As we move to more value-based reimbursement paradigms, theoretically, if done right, it actually should start to shift where we should see more reward for the diagnostic and earlier intervention if the reward incentives start to reward, kind of the 4 Ps: prevention, prediction, personalization, as well as participation, to riff off Kathryn's earlier point. I think you already are seeing leading indicators. I mean, the concept of personalized medicine has been out there for a long time. The death of the blockbuster drug model has been opined about by consulting firms and others for the better part of a decade. But we're actually here now. And if you actually look at the drug pipelines, I forget the exact percentages, but in phase 1, phase 2 trials, the percentage of therapeutics making their way through the system with a companion diagnostic is several-fold higher than it was just 4 or 5 years ago. So I think we're starting to see, the classic Gartner hype cycle, right? There's a big hype, then there's a trough of disillusionment, and then you actually start to see it emerge. I think we're just starting to see this from a commercial perspective emerge in a big, meaningful way beyond the early, proof points that have been out there for years, like Herceptin and others.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I definitely want to make sure we have time for questions. Is there anyone who has a question that they would like to pose to the panel? Right here, white shirt. And I think there's a gentleman with a microphone who'd be able to help you out. And if you could just stand up while you're at it. Thanks.
So in light of some of the data security issues we've seen in other areas, I guess it's a two-part question. The first is, do you think it's more a question of when as opposed to whether there'll be a meaningful disclosure or breach around privacy data in the health marketplace? And then the second part of the question is, if and when that does happen, how do you think that impacts the general psyche of the population around their willingness to share that data?
So I can take a first shot at that. We first of all, in my business, I follow the feeds and the blogs and everything all day long, and there's like a breach a day almost. You don't hear about it because they're relatively small, but you also don't hear about it because they become relatively commonplace, and you don't see some huge fallout from it. So someone loses a laptop with 5,000 patients on it, and so then that provider has to protect those patients for a year, do credit protection and all that. But there's never this big explosion of giant class action lawsuit where some provider has to pay billions of dollars in damages. So I think
there's lawyers in the audience that you might be giving ideas.
I agree, but it hasn't happened. So that I think people are getting comfortable that, all right, it happens regularly. There's not this huge downstream effect that we thought would happen. We're still being vigilant and diligent about it. We still have to protect ourselves. But because of that, and there's also been a whole industry now of insurance providers providing breach insurance. So now if you're a provider and you have breach insurance, you kind of relax a little bit, just like you have malpractice insurance. So there's, I don't think there's going to be this big, huge breach. And if there is, it would have to be 1 million records that someone got and did something very dastardly with. And,
yeah, I think the question is, what are you going to do with this information? I mean, I can tell you, our house was broken into a week ago. Laptop was stolen. All our tax information, was on the laptop, financial information. I mean, that's a freaking disaster. I'm paranoid about identity theft. We blocked all our bank accounts and everything. You can have my entire genome. Go have at it. I mean, it's really, I think we need to be conscious about what is the information content of the data that we're talking about. Sure, if, the laptop with the 1,000 patient information has all the social security information and all that stuff, that's a problem. But that's not a medical problem. So I think we have to be clear about the data itself.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of startups in the room, so I think the other consideration on this topic as it relates to HIPAA and other things is the implication for vendors. So I'm assuming a lot of folks in the vendor community are familiar with the business associate agreement. I'm sure Brian has had a lot of fun negotiating these with a number of vendors at Penn.
All the time.
But that's a big consideration for startup companies that are getting into the data space, because there is more and more liability being pushed from the provider to other covered entities through the business associate agreement. So if you're a startup in this space, it's definitely something to look at and understand, because it will have implications for your business.
One of my favorite things to do is to meet with a small startup. There are lots of them in this area, and they like to meet with Penn. And so I start to throw out things like personal liability, personal jail time, millions of dollars of liability insurance, and all these things that a lot of these folks just don't think about. And you have to think about, you, the CEO of the company, could go to jail, if you're prosecuted for some large breach, and that tends to change people's perspective on the importance of security and privacy.
Well, and if I'm just going to comment on what you all are saying. I think unfortunately, historically, we've just had some really bad examples where people have had serious breaches of privacy, right? And they're made very public. So the Henrietta Lack story, I think, really, I think set us backwards quite a bit in some ways in terms of the public perception of personalized medicine and research and discovery. On the other hand, though, since learning about these historical examples, we have developed systems to try to avoid these situations again, right? So we now have IRBs, we have consent and whatnot, and I think that it hasn't. I think that it hasn't reached the general public well enough. This education again about what we have done and all the good things that are being done to protect people, so that this doesn't happen again.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think just very briefly to add to this, I think that we have to realize that there are tremendously powerful systems in place to protect that information. I mean, I worked at, as I mentioned, the pharmacy benefit management company. The IT security about healthcare data was tremendous. It was unbelievable. You could not stick a USB drive in your laptop and download data. This was all blocked off. There's no way you could get any data out of that system. So I think we have that. On the other hand, we also have to realize that, I don't know if all of you, but I certainly go and shop at Amazon and other online places pretty frequently. There was a big debate over whether you're going to be able to use your credit card information on the internet. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? That was maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Now everybody's doing it. Because we also believe that we have appropriate, not foolproof, but appropriate measures in place to protect ourselves.
Right.
Felix, we're all sorry to hear about your home break-in. That's unfortunate. We had a question right here. White shirt.
Thank you. To get to the personalized, we have to go through the massive. We've got huge data sets. We've got genomic information, 3 billion base pair for one individual. You've got millions of individuals whose data you're going to look to aggregate. From your perspective, do we have the tools and the analytical capabilities right now? Or what are we lacking? What would you like to see, the innovators in this room, what would you like to see them developing that would help us get to the personalized even faster than we are now?
So we've just purchased a solution, in fact, to begin to build that research data warehouse and to bring all that data together. Their genetics and the processing of genetic information, sequencing and sequence alignment, and all that post-processing work is still a very unstructured, unstandardized industry. There's this thing called a VCF file, a variant call file, and that someone came up with that at some academic institution, or maybe Illumina came up with it, or some vendor, and that's become the de facto standard for how you share detailed genetic data. Well, that's just. It's not HL7. It's not something that that's easily exchanged. There aren't any. It's kind of an open standard, not really structured. You can kind of do what you want with it. There's very few required fields, but that's the default way you share data, for example. So that's an area that we could use help in just building some standards and building tools for exchanging genetic data. One of the huge blocks for Penn right now, we have 2 high-performance computing clusters with a petabyte of storage each. We're about to add another petabyte to them, so we're going to have 2 petabytes of storage and 2,000 high-performing cores of compute. The biggest problem for us is moving data from place to place to place. The highest speed network you can get generally today from building to building is 10 gigabytes. Well, if you're going to move terabytes of data, hundreds of terabytes of data over 10 gigabytes is going to take days. And, so just moving data from the machine to the place to analyze it is a problem. So we need the vendors to figure out how to make data move faster, higher compression technologies, higher ways to analyze the data, ways to shrink the number of bytes that we have to move from place to place. Those are 2 examples.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Brian said. The other thing I would add is, at least from my point of view, having been in the personalized medicine space for well over a decade now, the technology I'm more and more confident is going to come. It may be a year from now, it might be 3 years from now, but the technology limitations, there's enough investment, both in startups as well as in big multinationals going into the space, that I think the technology issues are going to sort themselves out. The thing that keeps me up at night that I'd encourage entrepreneurs and innovators to think about is how to marry that technology progress with new business model innovation around it, because there's a whole host of additional bottlenecks we're going to hit once we get this bubble pushed down, there'll be 4 more that emerge. And we've talked about some of them today. A big one is just the lack of deep informaticists out there who can actually take advantage of the tools once they exist. So, I mean, that's just one of 12 examples. So I'd encourage to think about not just the technology innovation, but new business models, new value creation models around that technology, because I think that's where the next big bottlenecks are going to be.
Yeah, we spend 95% of our time and resources in the analytics department at Medco on data cleaning and data compatibility, and about 5% on actual computation and analysis of the data.
And we are pretty much out of time. If there's one question left, I invite it in the back, way in the back. And it may have to necessitate a shortish answer.
Thank you. Two-part question. One is your point of view on who really owns the data. Is it the healthcare consumer or the system or the institution? And then the second part is what would be the impact of HIPAA Omnibus, which is coming in September, in terms of ownership of the data?
Brian, you want to take that?
So my personal opinion, I'm not a lawyer or a privacy expert, is that the ownership is shared between the patient and the provider that captured the data. So we expended our technology and our expertise to gather and capture that data and electronically store it. So we should have rights to own and retain that data. But we also should provide that data, as much of it as we can, electronically back to the patient who, it's about them. So I think it's a shared ownership. Obviously, the patient gives us some consent just by the fact that we're treating them to have access to their data. What we've talked about here is what happens in a research space. The consent for research is different. So I think it's a shared ownership. That's my short answer.
Anyone want to take the second part of that question about HIPAA Omnibus?
I don't know.
I'll take it. I mean, it just gets worse, right? It just gets worse. Gets worse, harder, worse. We've got to track everything. We've got to, we're just at risk, more and more at risk every day for the data and what might happen to it. We can't let you, as Felix said, you can't be plugging in USB drives. We can't let you email the data out. We can't let you do anything to the data. And it's going to constrain the ability to do make these discoveries, because if you can't move the data around quickly and easily, then you've got to keep it all in one place, and as Brett said, let people come to the data, not give the data to them. It makes collaboration very difficult between multiple institutions trying to do research on the same population of patient data, and because everyone is liable for that breach. And now it also makes every cloud vendor that we use, now that we don't use that many, but the ones that we use are now automatically become accidental business associates. If they have our data, they are now a business associate, whether they want to be one or not, and they've got to figure out if they want to be in that business. Does Box want to be a business associate to everybody that puts data on their system? Does Dropbox want to be a business associate? Amazon? Probably not. But by default, with that new rule, they are a business associate.
Well, with that, we're going to have to conclude, but let me be the first to thank this awesome panel, and please do enjoy the rest of your day at Med City Convergence.